When I think back to that night, it almost feels unreal, like a memory that doesn't belong to me. It was supposed to be a joyful family party, a reunion after months of everyone being scattered across cities and busy with their own lives. My parents had gone all out, renting a hall, decorating it with gold streamers, white roses, and a chandelier that sparkled like frozen rain. I hadn't seen most of my relatives in nearly a year, and even though I dreaded the inevitable comparisons to my older sister, I wanted to show up with my head high for once. Growing up, my sister Clara always overshadowed me. She was taller, louder, more outgoing, and constantly praised by our parents for everything from her grades to her fashion sense. I was the quieter one, the bookish girl who stayed out of the spotlight. Family gatherings usually revolved around Clara, and I'd end up shrinking into the background, pretending I didn't notice how people looked past me to ask about her career, her relationships, her style. It had become routine, and I'd made peace with being invisible, or at least, I thought I had. That night, I chose to wear a simple black dress, elegant, nothing extravagant. But I paired it with a silver necklace my grandmother had left me, one of the few heirlooms that was truly mine. I didn't plan to make a statement, but when I walked into the hall, the room went quieter than usual. A few cousins complimented me, my aunt smiled warmly, and even some of Clara's friends turned their heads. It was a small moment, but I felt something shift inside me, a flicker of confidence I wasn't used to carrying. Clara noticed almost immediately. She wore a sequined gown that shimmered under the lights, and usually, she would have been the center of every gaze. But that night, for once, not everyone's eyes were on her. I saw her watching me, her lips pressed tightly together, her smile stiff as though she was holding back a storm. I brushed it off, not wanting to assume anything, but her gaze followed me everywhere I went. As the evening went on, people kept approaching me. An uncle asked about my new job. A cousin introduced me to her fiancé, and even my father, who usually barely acknowledged me at these events, said I looked grown up. It shouldn't have meant so much, but it did. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Clara didn't take it well. I caught snippets of her muttering to friends, little digs about how my dress was too plain or that I was trying too hard. But I ignored them, focusing instead on enjoying the rare moment where I wasn't in her shadow. I laughed more freely, spoke louder than usual, and for once, people actually listened. Then came the turning point. Dinner was being served, and the room was buzzing with chatter and clinking glasses. I walked past Clara to grab a plate, smiling politely as I did. That's when she stopped me, grabbing my wrist in front of everyone. "Do you really think you're better than me tonight?" she hissed, her voice just low enough for nearby relatives to hear. I froze. The music was still playing, but conversations around us faltered as people turned to see what was happening. "Clara, let go," I whispered, not wanting to cause a scene. But she wasn't having it. Her eyes flashed, and before I could move, she slapped me. The sound cracked through the room like a whip. For a moment, everything stood still. My cheek burned, and I could feel every pair of eyes on us. Shock rippled across the crowd, followed by a stunned silence that made the chandelier's hum seem louder. My aunt gasped. My cousin's fork clattered onto her plate, and my father's face turned an alarming shade of red. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Clara had always belittled me with words, but never in my life had she raised her hand against me. The humiliation sank deep, but underneath it was something else. A cold, sharp clarity. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just sibling rivalry. This was about control. Clara couldn't stand the thought of me being noticed, even for one evening, and she'd rather publicly humiliate me than let me have it. The room erupted after that. My mother rushed over, scolding Clara, though not too harshly because even then, she couldn't bear to truly reprimand her golden child. A few relatives pulled me aside, fussing over my cheek, whispering words of comfort, while others whispered behind their hands, already turning the moment into gossip. Clara stood in the center, arms crossed, looking both furious and unrepentant. I excused myself to the restroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My cheek was still red, my eyes watery though I hadn't shed tears. My heart hammered in my chest, but beneath the pain and humiliation, something hardened. I wasn't going to let this moment define me as the weak one anymore. That slap was more than just a moment of violence. It was a declaration. Clara wanted to remind me of my place, but instead, she had given me the resolve to finally step out of hers. When I stepped back into the party, I noticed how quickly the atmosphere had shifted. People were no longer laughing freely, and the music seemed like background noise no one was paying attention to. Groups of relatives stood in clusters, murmuring, glancing at me, then at Clara, as though they were watching the aftermath of a scandal unfold. Clara, of course, had resumed her role as if nothing had happened. She stood tall, wineglass in hand, her sequined gown glittering under the lights, making small talk with some distant cousins who were too uncomfortable to acknowledge what had just occurred. Her smile was wide, but it didn't reach her eyes. She looked at me once, briefly, with a smirk that only I could read, an unspoken message that she believed she'd put me back in my place. But something inside me had shifted. Instead of shrinking, I lifted my chin and walked back into the room. The whispers followed me, but I didn't care. I forced myself to sit at a table with some aunts and uncles, answering their concerned questions calmly, as though the sting on my cheek wasn't still fresh. I could feel Clara watching me from across the room, waiting for me to storm out. But I didn't. Leaving would have been surrender, and I was done surrendering. The rest of the evening dragged on awkwardly. Every toast felt flat, every laugh forced. I could barely taste the food on my plate, but I forced myself to eat. I wanted to show everyone that I wasn't going to crumble under Clara's hand. My father said little, though I noticed the way he clenched his jaw, glancing at Clara with a rare expression of disappointment. My mother hovered around, as though trying to erase the incident by keeping everyone distracted. Yet the damage was already done. No one would forget that slap. When the party ended around 11:00 p.m., I slipped out quietly, refusing to exchange words with Clara. My phone buzzed with texts from cousins, some apologizing, some gossiping, but I ignored them. By the time I reached home, exhaustion settled deep in my bones. I thought I'd collapse into bed and sleep, but instead I found myself pacing, the image of Clara's smirk looping in my mind. It wasn't just the slap, it was the years of being overlooked, belittled, compared, and dismissed. The sting on my cheek was temporary, but the wound in my pride had been festering for years. That night, I realized I couldn't keep playing the role of the quiet, overshadowed sister anymore. Clara had drawn the line, and I had a choice: either accept my place in her shadow forever, or finally stand in the light. The following morning, I decided to confront her. I didn't tell anyone, not even my parents. I drove to her apartment around 10 Desura, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. When she opened the door, she looked surprised to see me. She was in her robe, her hair messy, clearly not expecting visitors. "Well, if it isn't the star of last night's drama," she said dryly, leaning against the doorframe. I ignored the jab and walked past her into the living room. "We need to talk." Clara sighed theatrically, closing the door behind me. "If this is about last night, I already know what you're going to say. You think I embarrassed you. You think I crossed the line. But let's be real. You love the attention you got from it." Her words stunned me. "Attention, Clara. You humiliated me in front of our entire family." "Oh, please," she scoffed, pouring herself coffee as if we were discussing the weather. "You've always been the quiet one, the invisible one. You should be thanking me. Now people actually notice you exist." Her casual cruelty made my stomach churn. I stared at her, finally seeing her for what she was not, the glamorous, untouchable sister everyone adored, but someone so fragile in her need for control that she'd rather destroy me than share the spotlight. "You're wrong," I said quietly, my voice steady in a way it had never been before. "People don't respect me because you slapped me. They respect me because I didn't let it break me. And from now on, I'm not going to let you control how I see myself." Clara's smile faltered for the first time. She put down her mug, narrowing her eyes. "Don't make this into some empowerment speech. You'll always be second best, and deep down, you know it." I took a deep breath, stepping closer to her. "Maybe I was second best in your story, but I'm done living in it." The silence that followed was sharp. For once, Clara didn't have a comeback. I turned and walked out, my heart pounding, but lighter than it had felt in years. That confrontation didn't solve everything overnight, but it was the start of a shift. I knew Clara wouldn't change, but I could. And for the first time, I was determined to. In the weeks that followed, the family party became the unspoken topic of every phone call, group chat, and casual coffee meeting among our relatives. I could feel the weight of their eyes even when I wasn't around them. Every cousin, every aunt, every uncle had their version of what happened that night. Some exaggerated, others downplayed it, but the slap always remained at the center of the story. For the first time, though, the narrative didn't crush me. Instead, it gave me fuel. I had been quiet for so long, letting Clara and others define who I was. But now, people were finally asking me questions directly, and I refused to shrink back into silence. When my aunt invited me to lunch, I showed up confident, hair styled, makeup done, clothes sharp not for anyone else, but for myself. When she tried to bring up the incident gently, I smiled and told her I was fine, steering the conversation toward my career goals and hobbies. I wanted people to see me as more than Clara's younger sister. Meanwhile, Clara grew restless. I could tell from the way she posted obsessively on social media photo shoots, parties, extravagant dinners that she was desperate to reclaim the center stage. But no matter how she tried, the memory of that night hung over her. Our relatives weren't fawning over her like before. Instead, they were whispering about her temper, her jealousy, her inability to control herself. One evening, around 8:00 p.m., my father called me unexpectedly. His voice was gruff but gentler than I was used to. "I want you to know I was ashamed of what Clara did," he said. "I didn't say much that night, but I should have. You didn't deserve that." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My father had always been Clara's biggest supporter, the one who praised her no matter what and left me in the shadows. Hearing those words from him was like a crack in the armor that had always protected her. "Thank you," I whispered, my throat tight. "Don't let her convince you that you're less," he added. "I see you, even if I didn't always before." That call stayed with me. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was acknowledgement, and it mattered. Clara, however, didn't take the shift well. A week later, she showed up at my apartment without warning, banging on the door until I let her in. Her eyes were blazing, her words sharp. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Everyone feeling sorry for you? Everyone turning against me? You're playing the victim, and it's pathetic." I stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "I'm not playing anything. Clara, people are just finally seeing you for who you are." Her face twisted with rage. "Don't act like you're innocent. You love this attention. You think you've won because Dad called you, because some cousins suddenly remember your name." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match her anger. I simply said, "It's not about winning. It's about finally living my life without needing your approval." For once, Clara was the one who stormed out, slamming the door behind her. After that confrontation, I noticed another change. Friends who had once gravitated toward Clara began reaching out to me instead. Cousins who had always assumed I was the quiet background figure now invited me to join their plans. It wasn't about popularity. It was about finally having space to exist on my own terms. But with that shift came a strange sense of guilt. I had wanted this change for so long, but part of me couldn't shake the sadness of watching my sister unravel. Clara had built her entire identity on being admired, envied, worshipped even. Now that the pedestal had cracks, she was flailing, and though she had brought it upon herself, she was still my sister. That guilt didn't erase the hurt, but it made me pause. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want her destroyed. I just wanted freedom from her shadow. One night, I sat at my desk around 11:00 p. journaling the thoughts I'd never said aloud. I wrote about the years of silence, the sting of her words, the heaviness of being compared. I wrote about the slap, the shock, the shift it caused in me. And finally, I wrote about my choice to live my life with dignity, not as her rival, but as myself. It wasn't about outshining Clara, it was about shining for the first time in my own way. Spring came, and with it another round of family gatherings, birthdays, anniversaries, casual dinners. Normally, I would have dreaded them, knowing Clara would be there, commanding attention like always. But this time, I felt different. I wasn't walking into those rooms as the timid sister anymore. I carried myself with a calmness that surprised even me, speaking clearly, laughing freely, and no longer waiting for permission to belong. At one such dinner, I arrived wearing a soft blue dress, simple but elegant. Heads turned, and not because I was trying to outshine anyone, it was simply that I no longer hid. Clara sat at the other end of the table, stiff, smiling too widely, her eyes darting toward me now and then. The energy between us was undeniable, and everyone felt it. But instead of shrinking, I kept my head high, participating in conversations and letting myself be present. Halfway through the meal, my uncle raised his glass and said, "I just want to say how proud I am of both of you girls. You've both grown so much." He meant it as a peace offering, a way to smooth the lingering tension. Clara forced a laugh, while I simply nodded. It was one of those moments where I realized how much had changed. In the past, a comment like that would have made me feel invisible, overshadowed. Now, I no longer needed validation to feel whole. After dessert, as people mingled in the living room, Clara approached me. Her expression was guarded, her tone measured. "So, this is the new, you confident, chatty, everyone's favorite." I looked at her calmly. "No, this is just me. The me you've tried to silence for years." Her lips tightened. "You really think you're better than me now? Don't you?" I shook my head. "No, Clara, I don't think I'm better than you. I just finally know I'm not less." For a moment, She had no reply. Her eyes flickered with something almost like fear, or maybe realization. She turned away quickly, excusing herself to talk to another cousin. It struck me then that her power over me had never been in her beauty, her charm, or her wit. It had always been in my willingness to believe I was beneath her. The moment I stopped believing that, she lost control. Still, I couldn't ignore the sadness that lingered. Clara was my sister. As much as she hurt me, part of me wished we could be close, that she could see me not as a threat, but as family. But people only change if they want to, and I knew Clara wasn't ready. Weeks later, I received a call from my mother around 7 p. Mum. She sounded tired, her voice carrying that edge of worry she tried to hide. Your sister isn't doing well, she said softly. She's been isolating herself, lashing out at friends, even skipping work. I think she feels like she's losing everything. I listened quietly, conflicted. A part of me felt vindicated after all. She had brought this upon herself, but another part of me, the softer part, felt compassion. Jealousy had made her cruel, but underneath it, Clara was just a woman terrified of losing relevance, of not being enough. That night, I decided to visit her. She opened the door looking tired, her usual glamorous facade cracked, makeup smudged, hair unkempt. She seemed smaller somehow. For the first time, I didn't see my intimidating sister. I saw a woman who was just as insecure as I had been for years. What do you want? She muttered, her voice brittle. To talk, I said simply. She scoffed, but let me in. The apartment was a mess. Clothes scattered, empty glasses on the table, the curtains drawn against the evening light. She slumped onto the couch, crossing her arms. So what? You came here to rub it in, to tell me how everyone likes you better now. I sat across from her, shaking my head. No, Clara, I came because you're my sister, and despite everything, I don't want to see you fall apart. Her eyes glistened for a moment before she blinked it away. You don't understand. I've always been the one people admired. If I'm not that, then who am I? Her question broke something open in me. I leaned forward. You're more than people's admiration, but you have to believe that yourself. The same way I had to learn I was more than your shadow. For a long time, she said nothing. Just sat there, staring at the floor, her facade slowly unraveling. I didn't press her. I knew she wasn't ready to fully face it, but the fact that she didn't throw me out, didn't lash at me, was progress in itself. As I left her apartment that night, I realized something important. Healing wasn't about winning, and it wasn't about revenge. It was about breaking the cycle, choosing not to let someone else's bitterness dictate who I was. Clara might never change, but I already had. Summer rolled in, and by then the tension between Clara and me had softened, though it hadn't vanished. We weren't suddenly best friends, nor did we pretend to be. But there was a quiet shift, an unspoken acknowledgement that things could not go back to the way they once were. At family events, she no longer tried to dominate every conversation, and I no longer shrank away. We existed side by side, and though the air still carried traces of rivalry, there was also a fragile truce. At one gathering in late July, my grandmother's old friend pulled me aside. She was a woman who had known us since childhood, someone who had witnessed years of Clara's spotlight and my silence. She squeezed my hand and said, "You've grown into yourself, dear. I can see it in your eyes. Don't ever let anyone dim that light again." Her words sank deep. For so long, I had believed that shining would only invite ridicule or envy. But now, I understood that hiding had only hurt me. That slap at the family party, painful as it had been, had become the spark I needed to step out of the shadows. Clara and I had one final conversation that summer, one that stays with me even now. It was late in the evening, around 9:00 p.m., when she showed up at my place unannounced. She looked calmer than before, though her pride was still stitched into every movement. She sat on my couch, fidgeting with her bracelet before finally speaking. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice hesitant, "about that night, about everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I know I went too far." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from her. And while part of me wanted to demand more to make her admit every cruel word, every time she'd pushed me down, the larger part of me simply felt tired of carrying the weight. "I don't need a perfect apology," I told her softly. "I just need you to understand that I won't live in your shadow anymore. If we're going to have any kind of relationship, it has to be different." She nodded, slowly, her eyes darting away. "I don't know if I can change overnight." "You don't have to," I said. "But you can start by seeing me as your sister, not your competition." The silence that followed wasn't hostile for once. It was reflective, heavy, but in a healing way. She didn't promise me miracles, but she didn't dismiss me either. That was enough. From that point forward, I began to focus on building a life that wasn't defined by her at all. I poured energy into my career, pursued hobbies I'd neglected, and deepened friendships outside the family circle. I stopped measuring myself against Clara, and in doing so, I finally felt free. People still whispered about that infamous slap, but over time, it became less about humiliation and more about transformation. The night Clara struck me was the night I chose to stand tall, and I would never let myself forget that. Looking back now, I realize that life has a strange way of using even the ugliest moments to teach us who we are. I never thought I'd say it, but I'm grateful for what happened that night. It was the push I needed, the painful but necessary jolt that made me claim my own identity. Clara and I are still works in progress. She has moments where her jealousy resurfaces, and I have moments where old wounds sting again, but I've learned to draw boundaries without guilt, to speak without trembling, to live without waiting for someone else's approval. And that, more than anything, is the victory I never knew I needed. So if there's one lesson I carry from all of this, it's this: sometimes the people closest to you will try to dim your light because they're afraid of losing their own. But dimming yourself only keeps you trapped. When you finally choose to shine fully, unapologetically, you don't just change how others see you. You change how you see yourself, and that changes everything. If you've ever felt overshadowed, invisible, or silenced, I hope my story reminds you that you are more powerful than you know. You don't have to wait for permission to step into your own light. The moment you decide to, you'll realize it was yours all along. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment with your thoughts. I'd love to hear if you've ever faced something similar and how you overcame it.